Forget Hastings in 1066 for a moment, if you will. The nation of England was created far earlier. It was born on the battlefield in blood and conquest during the first half of the 10th century AD, during that great fight back against the Scandinavians of the Great Heathen Army, who, a generation earlier, had conquered most of the previously independent kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon men and women of this time period, whose very recent ancestors had thought of themselves not as Englishmen, but as Mercians, West Saxons, East Anglians, Kentish men, and Northumbrians, now seem to have, at least in part, began to think of themselves as one nation, united out of the necessity of fighting back against an onslaught of invaders from beyond the sea. By the time of Alfred the Great's succession to the throne of Wessex in 871, Scandinavians had been coming to Britain in search of wealth and power for generations. The previously mostly localised and fairly small-scale raids had become larger and larger in recent years, soon converging by Alfred's time into a huge and terrible combined force of warriors and warlords, allegedly led by the sons of the semi-legendary heroic figure Ragnar Lothbrok. The army was dubbed the Great Heathen Army by the Christian writers of the time, and one by one, every Anglo-Saxon kingdom bar one fell to its ferocity. The local monarchies which had existed for centuries were either brutally killed by the invaders or fled to the continent, never to reclaim their thrones. By 878, the only kingdom left against the encroaching storm was Wessex, with Alfred at its head. Later that year, against all the odds, and despite repeated attempts at conquest, this last English kingdom simply refused to submit, and after falling back temporarily to the marshlands of Somerset with just a handful of followers, Alfred rallied his people together for one final decisive battle. It was fought at Edington in May 878, and the English victory that was won there definitively pushed the Danes and Norsemen back out of Wessex. They would be back many times over the coming decades, but by and large, the overall trend would be a gradual reconquest of the Danelaw. It is at this time, during this fight back, that Alfred may have first began to conceive of the concept of a unified English nation. Although he wouldn't live to see this become a reality, for the rest of his reign, Alfred, now often styling himself as the king of the Anglo-Saxons, would dedicate his life to defeating the Vikings once and for all, and restoring the former territories of the Anglo-Saxons. His son Edward would go on to continue this mission after his death in 899, and also his daughter Æthelflæd, who solely ruled Mercia as Lady of the Mercians from 911 until 918. It was during the year 917 that one of the most decisive moments came in the long war against the Vikings of the Danelaw. A battle was fought at Tempsford in East Anglia between Edward and the Vikings of East Anglia, possibly under their king Guthrum II. In the aftermath of the battle, East Anglia was finally won back by the West Saxons, but it still had to be held, its defences solidified against future attacks from opportunistic Danes, of which there were always more to replace the ones that had been killed. Politically savvy strongmen were needed during this time to hold the newly won lands together and to forge a newfound sense of united Anglo-Saxon identity. One of these powerful men was Æthelfrith, a West Saxon ealdorman who had held part of southern Mercia during Edward's reign. He was part of a new breed of warrior lords that would dedicate themselves to fighting back tooth and nail over the coming decades, matching the Danes sword for sword with their military prowess. Æthelfrith's influence was apparently so great that after his death in around 915, 4 of his sons, Æthelstan, Æthelwold, Eadric and Æthelstan, would go on to become ealdormen in Mercia, Kent, Hampshire and East Anglia respectively, each successfully clinging on to these territories for the crown and warding off any further Viking incursions with their firm, strong-handed rule. The most famous of all these brothers, however, and in his time the foremost ealdorman in all of England, was Æthelstan Half-King, named as such for his close association with several consecutive English kings. Half-King served as the ealdorman of East Anglia from 932 until 956, and he was one of the foremost military commanders of the mid to late Anglo-Saxon period, sometimes called the imperial phase of Anglo-Saxon history. He gained his reputation and status during the reign of Æthelstan between 924 and 939. further solidified his position during the reigns of Æthelstan's successors, Edmund and Eadred, eventually rising to such a position that he even fostered Edmund's youngest son and future king Edgar as his own after his father's death in 946. Although largely forgotten today, England was made on the backs of men such as Æthelstan Half-King. A loyal subject to his namesake Æthelstan, who succeeded Edward as king of the Anglo-Saxons in 924, but went even further in 927 upon the conquest of the last Viking stronghold of York, in calling himself, for the first time in history, King of the English in 927, thus finally realising the dreams of his grandfather Alfred all those years before. In 932, presumably because of his service to the king, Half-King was given control of East Anglia, the territories that had been won by Edward at the Battle of Tempsford back in 917, now a cultural melting pot of Saxon and Dane, and often a wild, lawless place given its substantial share of Scandinavian settlers who had flooded there after the time of the Great Heathen Army. Half-King's brother, Ælfstan, became ealdorman of some parts of Mercia at about this time, and both of them very likely participated in King Æthelstan's invasion of Scotland in 934. They were both also likely present at the subsequent English victory over a combined Scoto-Scandinavian Strathclyde alliance at Brunanburh in 937, which further cemented England's sovereignty and newly found dominion over the rest of Britain. It is also around this time that Half-King's other two brothers, Eadric and Ethelwald, are recorded as having witnessed charters as ealdormen. This may have been a result of Half-King's strong influence, often likened in later years to the immense power held by the Godwin family a century later during the reigns of Canute and Edward the Confessor. Half-King continued to serve Æthelstan's successors Edmund and Eadred, both sons of Edward the Elder, until his retirement upon the succession of Edmund's son Eadwig in 955. It has later been suggested that this retirement may have not actually been voluntary, although very little concrete information exists on the subject. It is known that Half-King and his wife Elfwin, who came from the East Midlands, fostered Edmund's younger son and future king Edgar after his father's death in 946. This situation could suggest some level of factionalism within the royal family at the time, and possibly explain Half-King's alleged forced retirement after the succession of Edgar's older brother Eadwig. After his death, Half-King was succeeded as ealdorman in East Anglia by his son Ethelwald, although upon his death in 962, the family's offices in Wessex fell to their chief familial rivals, that of Elfhere of Mercia, which then made the families roughly equal in influence. Half-King's descendants continued to be important and influential leaders in the decades and centuries that followed. In particular, he is often closely associated with ealdorman Brythnoth, whose defeat against a new wave of Viking invaders at the Battle of Maldon in 991 was later commemorated in an epic poem of the same name, and heralded a new era of Viking invasions from Scandinavia.